I am very excited for this session, partly because I'm a big fan of everybody on this call, who's on this panel, but also as well because I love the policy side of micromobility and I think a lot about it. I think it's one of these sort of really knotty and hard, interesting problems as we think about the new world of these new vehicles as they come into our city and they remake our fabric, and we have to rethink and remake a lot of the assumptions that we've had around how to do transport in our urban environments with this new technology and these new vehicles that enable us to get around in new ways. So I'm going to hand this off really to Michelle, and Michelle will take us through with the various speakers. The structure will be they talk for sort of 3 to 5 minutes or so, each of them, and then what we will do is I'll invite discussion after that. And the way I'd love for this to work is if you can just ask a question, type it into the chat, and note that it is a question that you'd like to speak. And then what we can do is I will go and put that in as I will queue you up. So if you just click request audio and visual, and I'll select the questions that I've seen that have come through. And then bring you up to speak, and then you can ask that question. We can have a small discussion, and then I'll try and structure a relatively coherent, hopefully, discussion as we go along with everybody going through. So, look, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle. Thank you so much, Michelle, for being here, and thank you everybody actually for being here. Melinda, Andrew, great to see you all. I'm huge fans. So, go for it, Michelle.
Thanks, Oliver. So this is the participant part of the day. As Oliver said, we're each going to talk for 5 minutes, key out issues and questions. And then we really want to get everyone to contribute. It doesn't have to be a question. This is one of those few panels where we're actually going to say it's okay if you just have a call to be a question. We really want to have this be more of an interactive workshop style discussion. So we're going to tee up 4 policy topics and try to gather the best ideas. I'll go first. I'm Michelle Kairouz. I host the Cars podcast. I'm the author of a new book called Book, and I'm a lawyer by training, and so I love the policy stuff. So the first topic we wanted to start with are city permit programs and how they can be improved to make shared micromobility a more sustainable business. I wrote an article last April called How to Reboot Micromobility in Cities. I addressed this topic in my book. A lot of companies are a little reluctant to talk about these issues because they're really trying hard to get cities to accept them into their permit programs. But I'll be the one to say it. A lot of these permit programs are really onerous, causing huge costs for companies in cities around the world. Scooter companies are facing an up on unit economics and reaching profitability. So the key about today, how can cities revamp and rework their permit programs to make them more sustainable, to reset the rules? Some people say, well, these should subsidize or take over scooters as public transit. I don't think it's going to happen. I think cities could do 2 things that would make a difference: reduce and improve infrastructure, and get a financial contribution from cities. I think what would benefit companies really is the investment in infrastructure and also some of the costs. We know that micromobility is good. It has great road geometry. It offers the convenience of point-to-point transportation without creating traffic congestion. Yet cities are charging scooters that are an order of magnitude higher than cars. They're imposing regulatory burdens that don't apply to other modes or to owned micromobility. And that cost gets passed on to riders. So there are real costs for all of us in making it difficult for these companies to operate. There are all kinds of regulations that cities have imposed, from curfews and geofences, speed limits, to vehicle caps, parking mandates, to technology. Rules about clutter that have required expensive technology like sidewalk and automated repositioning. And the smallest vehicle in the city is being held to the highest standard, often making rides less affordable and hard to find but scooters travel places that can't, so maybe the rules are needed. So how can cities offset these burdens by reducing fees? If companies are investing in these technology solutions, and really reducing the need for city enforcement, can we see a reduction in fees that would really provide these services? And what can cities do to reduce the burden of permit applications themselves? These companies have teams of people across many countries filling out applications that are hundreds of pages. How can we really create a new process? Would love to get people's thoughts on how to start from scratch in designing the way we go about choosing who's going to operate in these cities. Should cities adopt a common application? If you have kids applying to college, you know there's a common app that applies. Could there be something like that that would reduce the burden? Perhaps NACTO could create it. And then there's the question of permits, often only lasting a year, preventing any real investment in a city for operations. Should cities set a minimum level of performance and allow automatic renewal every year for companies in compliance? Most operators want to see a limited number of permits in each city so it doesn't get too unwieldy. But competing for only 2 or 3 permits has created a dynamic that's really unsustainable. We're seeing new micromobility form factors, and there's more and more owned vehicles as well. Should there be a single set of rules for all devices, regardless of form factor, regardless of business model? Why can you ride your bike at night, but shared scooters have a curfew? And finally, what would be the most helpful infrastructure for cities to create? Should we have shared systems for charging or swapping or doing maintenance or parking? And how can cities help to create that infrastructure and reduce the individual burden on companies to deal with clutter and compliance? Those are my key issues. Tee up your comments in the chat. I'll turn it over to Andrew. Please introduce yourself and your topic.
Thanks, Michelle. So I run public policy at a place called Transit App. It's a multimodal trip planning application based in Montreal. It's the largest in North America. And I want to talk a bit about integration. And so I think a lot of you guys are here and you care about micromobility, not just because you want to build a great business, but you want to change the world. I mean, I think that's kind of the spirit of this whole event, and I'm supportive of that. I'm excited to see as many light electric vehicles replace Cadillac Escalades as possible. But I want to start by telling you a little bit story, little small story. I'm here in Montreal. I can open, this is a shameless plug, I can open Transit App, and I can magically buy a bus ticket, and then I can turn around and I can unlock a bike share without having to create a new account. And the number of places that I can do that in North America and buy services from different operators that don't own each other is very, very rare. It's vanishingly rare. And so, you know, why is that, right? I think if we think that's an important thing, and I can talk about why and how we think that's important, you know, why is it so rare? And so my topic is essentially this digital layer of integration. You know, I think mobility as a service, there's probably a lot of you who roll your eyes when you hear that term. It's kind of one of the more, I would say, overhyped concepts, but I think there's a nugget of truth buried in there that's important. And I think one of the reasons we haven't seen as much as we actually would like out of that concept is because we skipped over a lot of the digital plumbing that has to happen to make that kind of thing possible. So I'm going to try and go into the kind of unglamorous layer of integration a little bit and just talk about where we are, what's working, what seems to maybe not be working so well, and how we could do better. So I think this is an important element of policy and maybe one that we tend to gloss over between sort of glamorous mobility as a service pitches that elide a lot of the details. So on the good front, I think we can, you know, as an industry, micromobility and bike share before it can take a little bit of a bow on data standards. I think GBFS has kind of been a pretty big success. You know, created 5 years ago. I think most of you know what it does, but essentially it's a discovery data feed for scooters and bikes. And across North America, about 56% of cities' permits, which Michelle just talked about being onerous, but you know, in those permit applications, one of the things they tend to ask for is GBFS. That's pretty high. If you're a glass half full person, that's, you know, pretty strong adoption in 5 years. But still, a significant chunk don't ask for it. And even in those places where people are asking for a GBFS fee, that doesn't mean that consumers like us or others are getting one that is up to date and regularly, you know, kept up to a data quality that's going to work for consumers. So it's not perfect, but there's been some good progress there. I think there's things we have to do to help make that a little better. I think at one level, just at a conversation point of view, I think a lot of people are confused about the difference between something like MDS and GBFS. To me, those are really two wildly different things. One of those is a consumer-facing data feed, that's MDS. Regulator-facing feed, that's MDS, really for regulatory overview. And one of them is consumer-facing, and that's GBFS, and it's a whole different, ball of wax. So I think we've got some adoption. Many operators provide those kinds of feeds voluntarily, even where they're not required. So good things are happening, but I think more could happen. On the payment front, I just mentioned an example where it's easy to do, but most of the places that's happened are kind of older docked bike share systems. There's not a ton of inter-operator ticketing possibilities. So I think on the payment front, it's been very rare, certainly in North America, maybe a little more positive integration in Europe, but there's not a ton of places where cross-operator ticket purchase or integration is really possible here. And you might say, if you're an operator, or frankly, if you're anyone on the call, you might say, well, why is that so important? Why do I care if it's possible for people to easily integrate service? And I can say a few, selfish reasons that operators might care. I think at one level, I'm kind of surprised. I feel like micromobility, and this is a taunt to the micromobility industry, is a little behind, surprisingly, things like rideshare. I used to work at Uber, and there's a very large public transport partnership team that I helped to create a couple years ago that is getting lots of business supplementing, microtransit capacity or otherwise transit service. And as far as I know, and I can be corrected on this call, I haven't seen any micromobility service do that. Hopefully I'm wrong, but very little where someone is saying, well, we can't offer transit there. Here's a couple bucks for a scooter ride. And I think if we got the digital plumbing right and the integration, the payment right, there might be more possibility for that kind of money on the table. So that's my kind of carrot angle. And we don't just want to hear about sticks from a regulatory perspective. And the other important reason I think is that there's been a lot of, I think, good work from micromobility operators to offer voluntary discounts for lower income populations. Oftentimes those are hitched from an eligibility perspective to things like EBT that already existed. But actually getting those benefits for a scooter operator can be tough. You have to get a piece of each individual operator, and once you've proved it to one person, there's no way to transfer that proof of eligibility to anybody else. And you might have a transit operator that has a whole different set of requirements, and you have to kind of go and reprove your eligibility each time. So I think if we got better at cross account creation, we could have portable accounts that could prove your eligibility, and there's lots of benefits, I think, to making that possible. And that could open up some exciting stuff we've talked about, like a universal basic mobility account for people. I think there's a lot of interesting things that can happen, but we kind of have to get more of the digital plumbing in order for that to actually work. So that's why I think you should care. And then I'll just say, if you think these are good ideas, there's stuff you can do. If you're on this call and you're a DOT or someone who oversees a scooter operation, you have a ton of power, as Michelle just outlined in the permitting process. Maybe we can find ways to do that more efficiently, but I think there are a lot of places in North America that have asked for third-party payment integration in addition to things like GBFS. So there is a lot of leverage you have if you want to use it for things like this. And if you're an operator here in North America, I think there's a lot of good examples to learn from some of our European friends. There are teams at some of the European scooter operators that have titles like transit integration and mobility as a service. So there's some leadership there we can potentially copy. And last but not least, if you're a transit agency who I work with, we're seeing more transit agencies work directly to oversee bike and scooter operations in their cities. You saw with Austin recently, there's some work in Vegas and in Dayton as well. So there is, I think, more of a role potentially for public transport operators to take a step into micromobility, and that might help unblock some of the integration we're looking for too. So, if people think this is interesting, I'm interested to hear why, and why isn't it happening as much as possible? What might be possible if we do this? And if you think this is all a waste of time, I'm always interested to hear that too. So feedback, comments, welcome. And I will pass to Melinda next.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Melinda Hansen. I'm a co-founder at Electric Avenue, which is a public affairs and policy consulting firm that we launched in May of last year. My background before getting into micromobility was in urban planning and climate policy. I spent a lot of years actually working on the ground in emerging economies in Asia and in Africa, really trying to get bike lanes built and trying to get bike share systems going and trying to get BRT systems going. And it was slow and it was really, really frustrating at times. And that was one of the main reasons that I ended up transitioning over to micromobility, is because, we would spend years working on the perfect, bus design someplace, and it would just literally go nowhere. And then you see micromobility, you see all of these people suddenly switching out car trips for these electric scooters, and it's very exciting. It's amazing to see an industry that had moved so quickly in terms of getting people out of cars suddenly appear to start moving quickly. But the challenge that I faced when I joined Bird, and then now still advising a lot of micromobility companies, is that you really can't run away from that issue. The issue of infrastructure is fundamental and existential to this industry. Our streets over the past 100 years have been built for cars, and they are unfriendly places for micromobility vehicles. And we can be incredibly excited, and we should be really, really excited about all of this progress toward electric bikes and electric scooters. Everybody thought that there was a death sentence on the shared mobility companies. I think that they've really proven that that's not the case at all. There's a lot of room and there's a lot of demand. But how many scary instances can a new rider have before they totally give up on this mode? I would argue not very many. A lot of us on here are really gung-ho. Your general population is not very gung-ho about risking their life or feeling that they're risking their life. And I don't think that the micromobility industry has taken this very seriously. I think that there's a tendency in the industry to assume that technology will solve everything. A good example of this, right, is all of this effort that has gone into sidewalk detection, geofencing stuff, which isn't going to be perfect anytime soon, right? You're not going to be able to keep people off of sidewalks at that level of precision anytime soon. You're just not. But the only reason people ride on sidewalks is because there's no protected bike lane. So the real question and the real thing that needs to be addressed, and that I would argue would be a better use of all of our time to focus on, is how do we get more connected and protected bike lanes built? And so the question I would like to pose to this group to focus on is, what are we going to do about this? This is an existential issue that we need to address. So what is your company signing up to do, and how can we all work collectively together to really make this happen?
Oh, I'm so pumped for that. Great question. Excellent. All right. And Greg.
Hey, everybody. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's tough to follow three very talented and smart people that I think made some really good points, especially on the infrastructure side, and Andrew making really nice comments on, data standards and what does this all mean for next generation mobility solutions, and Michelle making comments about, varying and complicated regulatory structures on permits. And I guess, I'm excited that policy is finally getting its day in the sun, for lack of better words, although I'm in DC and it is freezing outside, even though it's sunny. But it is nice that policy is finally starting to matter. And I think it's because people are realizing it is the way to manage disruption. I think disruption gets thrown around very carelessly right now in a bad way. And I think, there's this opportunity, one, to realize we're all living in disruption as we all make our way through the pandemic and we all get to know each other's houses. Michelle, your family room looks lovely. Great use of the lights. But, the opportunity to manage disruption and to leverage disruption. I think everything we're talking about today is critical. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about data, which is a complicated issue. I in no way claim to have all the answers, and I'm excited to pose some questions to think about. So my name is Greg Rodriguez. I'm with Stantec, a mobility policy principal. I'm also an attorney, no longer practicing. When I was practicing, primarily represented local governments. For a time, I was in-house counsel of the San Diego Association of Governments and worked on large transit projects, have a public works background, and very much on a transactional basis. So all this is near and dear to my heart. And I'm very interested in privacy and data and how we really leverage all these next generation mobility solutions to just create a better status quo for transportation. I think that's the opportunity that's before us today and what we're all excited about. So why does data matter? I think in my work, as we've talked about, I think, Andrew, you talked about it, I've identified as a way to really think about, how do we have that integrated, seamless, interoperable mobility ecosystem? I think, Andrew, you hit the nail on the head. In other places outside of North America, you can have that app that's integrated where you can do a lot of different things. Here in the US, things get complicated when you bring in issues like licensing, data ownership, and it's that nasty word competition. And so in doing some work last year around guidelines for the SAA Mobility Data Collaborative, we really focused in on data sharing and how to promote alignment between the public and private sector. And some of the issues that we focused on is, how do we align those long-term interests and get past some of these short-term speed bumps? And again, unfortunately, micromobility is caught up in a political mess. It's trying to get through the after effects of a lot of communities, perhaps rightfully so, being burned by TNCs. And the data piece is becoming this political football, for lack of better words. And I think the danger with that and not taking a step back and maybe, before we over-regulate on anything and not understand the use cases, there is this danger of, taking away these opportunities that we don't even know about yet. And so that's, I would love for us all to be able to hit the pause button on the data issue, to really think about, what does MDS mean in this new environment? What about the existing standards that exist? Are there room to evolve into those? Do we need to take everything and just create something new? How do we deal with all that? And I think the complicated part of all this is, this conversation that's much bigger than just micromobility is, what does privacy mean this day and age? We're all sharing a lot of things on social media, but then the moment, we start talking about micromobility or transportation and that door-to-door trip, the privacy radars are going off very strongly, and rightfully so, because, these are sensitive places, going to hospitals, potentially going to drop off your kids at work. You think about these, opportunities for bike sharing through cargo bikes. This is all great, but there is that point-to-point part of it all that brings in this new dynamic, and then our use of digital applications and complicated things like geolocation information. These are all new things I think we need to be cognizant of from a user perspective. So some questions that I jotted down that I'd love for us to think about, how important is the sharing of data for the future of mobility? What should be priority uses for transportation data from digital applications? I already talked about, does privacy still matter this day and age? I think it does, but I think, that idea of privacy is going to evolve as we start talking about these, these cases that come up on the smart mobility side and try to, take the Carpenter v. US case to the next level within the public sector. All that is going to be really interesting to me. I mean, even just two cases in point that are being talked about in the news right now. One, when you think about the insurrection that happened here in DC, all those people were using their phones. It's pretty easy to pinpoint that you were there inside the Capitol if you get access to their geolocation information. Now, how that plays out with regard to the Fourth Amendment and things like that, and US v. Carpenter is really interesting to think about. But, these are the type of issues we're dealing with. And then in the news is, reports around Israel getting access to the vaccine very quickly because they're trading without consent the citizens' health data in exchange to Pfizer in exchange for access to the vaccine. So it's interesting to think about, here in the U.S., if Biden were to sign an executive order, and that's a big if that was even possible, to give away your data without your consent, but you would get this vaccine faster, would you be okay with that? I don't know, but I think that's just, those are two interesting examples I was thinking about that show this complicated issue of data and privacy really coming into focus here. And kind of maybe the last question on the transportation side, because I think what data should be for the public good? And if that data is for the public good, then should we limit the ability to potentially monetize that data? Because that is, the competition element is a big question. And then the monetization of what is going to happen with that data is the also kind of elephant in the room in the work that we've been doing in this space. So I think that's an interesting question to think about too, from, what data is for the public good, and important to think about as the movement is towards opt-out regulations when we think about GDPR and CCPA in California. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome. Wow, that was an amazing set of different points, but I think there's a lot of common threads that tie all of these together. So thank you. And for folks who are here, we've got about 100 of you. I'd be really keen to just bring you up onto the stage. And so the way that you can do that is by requesting to share your audio or video down the bottom there. And oh, look, perfect. Heidi, what I'm yeah. So folks, if you've got a question or anything like that, and you'd like to come up and be part of the discussion, sort of ask a question or make a comment about some of your work or other things, just put yourself in the chat, and then also as well drop a question or a comment in the chat and the thing you'd like to talk about, just so I can kind of structure and think about how to kind of bring the right people up at the right time, if that makes sense. Excellent. All right. Well, look, I'll bring you up, Heidi, now, and we'll go from there. Excellent.
Hi, thanks, Oliver. I wasn't expecting to be on camera, so sorry, hanging out in comics room. Just wanted to make a couple notes about some of the stuff that I was saying in the chat over there. So to some of what Greg and Andrew in particular were saying. So I'm with Mobility Data. We're a nonprofit organization. We govern the kind of de facto shared mobility and transit standards for traveler-facing information. But of course, what happens when those standards exist is that people find other uses for them. And because the standards that we govern are governed in a global consensus process that includes the data producers and the data consumers, it means that they are living, growing, changing things. So as Andrew mentioned, GBFS was created 5 years ago, really when docked bike share that was it. That's what we meant when we said shared mobility, and we didn't really say it. And now GBFS represents a lot more things. And so one of the things that has happened over time is that we have learned that researchers really like to use GBFS, that cities really like to use it for all kinds of different reasons, not necessarily in Andrew's kind of GBFS versus MDS. Like MDS definitely has a lot more sensitive data and it's used for regulation and compliance. But we know a lot of cities use GBFS to audit their MDS data. Some cities just use it because that's the level of information that they're interested in for their compliance efforts. And we recently made some privacy changes to it for the public data last year that cities have asked us to fix. So I mentioned on the side, we're having a GBFS private scoping meeting, which is kind of what happens when you run a consensus-based specification. Folks get to tell you they want changes, and then you have conversations about what it means to meet that. And for anybody in the room, I would just encourage you, because we do need the data producers and the consumers to agree on any changes we make. We really love to hear from everybody who's in this space. And for the research side too, we've heard that folks are having a really hard time getting a hold of MDS data for totally understandable reasons. And then once we've made GBFS more privacy centric, the researchers quickly figured out algorithms for how to determine origin destination data with the rotated IDs. So we'd like to just give them something that works for them rather than having them do workarounds and publishing those so that other people who maybe aren't as good-willed do that as well. So just wanted to throw that out there as an upcoming project that I would love input from anybody who's in this room.
Comments here from any of our folks?
I was going to say that thanks, Heidi, for piping up. I'm a big fan of Mobility Data's work, and I think it's interesting to hear the history of how a data standard evolves and how it gets used differently. And I think having a steward like you guys is important to keep that going. And I think my general take is the entire consumer public-facing piece of the data puzzle has gotten a tiny fraction of the attention that things like MDS have gotten, maybe for good reason. As Greg mentioned, there's lots of battles there that are, I think, grounded in much bigger issues. There's kind of been under the radar a little bit on things like how do we get consumer-facing tools, which, to your point, Heidi, don't always end up only being consumer-facing tools. But I would say that the fact that you guys exist, I'm a fan of, because I think there's just been a dominant conversation around regulatory data purposes and very little around the other half. So that's just my own comment, I think. But generally, I'm a big fan of the work that you guys do.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Heidi. I think the other important point you raise is the global piece of all this. So, again, in wanting to kind of challenge existing status quo, we do tend to operate in silos. When we're thinking about all these different regulations, and again, as we think about this next generation mobility revolution that's upon us, that hopefully comes to fruition, I think having more global consensus is a huge opportunity. And I mean, even when you think about organizations like the UN and things like this, I mean, the realization that transportation is connected to equity, livability, healthy communities is very real. And so it's, I mean, just, you know, thinking out loud, there's almost this opportunity to elevate this discussion much higher to just, you know, a livability perspective. And maybe that is the way to maybe elevate this to the right discussion point. But I think all your points are very well taken, and especially the, you know, the value of data, I think, to think about it from GBFS and even, you know, transit data that's collected as well. Like it does provide convenience. If you think about next bus, next train, that is all consumer facing and makes people want to use transit because it creates convenience. And so those are the positive use cases for data. So we need to keep focusing on those and make sure data continue to be shared to help us provide a better transportation system. So thank you for your work. I'll echo Andrew's sentiments.
Thanks, Greg.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay, do I step away now? I'm leaving.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Heidi. Really appreciate it. It's lovely to see you again. Excellent. All right, next up, I'm going to bring up Christopher Cherry, who is at University of Tennessee working in transport. Hey, how are you going, Chris? Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things I've heard this a lot about this, and it kind of queued up the session about permits, onerous permits, holding scooters and others at the highest standard when they're the incumbent and they don't get or they're not the incumbent. They don't get the benefit of the incumbency, essentially. And I think that scooters and others have opportunity. I posted the question up earlier about kind of taking the high road. The technology is there, the data is available. As a consumer of data, as an academic doing research that we just heard about, I think a lot about these applications. And there's a lot of big holes that we don't know for bicycling or for cars or others about safety exposure, environmental performance, or whatever else there is. And how do we how do you all find that happy medium where you provide that value add, say, hey, we're coming in and we're going to give you a really premium life cycle assessment of our product, and we're going to tell you where we fit in the safety spectrum, and the lousy incumbents that are terrible on the environment and are completely unsafe, we're going to do better than them, not as good as them. Look, is there a race to the lowest common denominator, or is there something higher? So that's kind of my question, I guess, and a comment that I'd like to hear from those on the line.
Well, I'll start by just saying there's always a request for more data, improve this, improve sustainability. Like, do you really need that much to see that scooters are less polluting and more beneficial than cars? And yes, you know, it'd be great to have data. But frankly, I think cities understand where the bike lanes need to go. And the holdup is not that, you know, we need to have like as many studies about it as let's just get it done and the political will. And I know some people were saying in the comments, like, let's have folks who work in micromobility really kind of push for this kind of advocacy. And, you know, I'm not sure kind of what else scooter companies and bike companies should be doing or that you're suggesting they should be doing. But I think we can see that reallocating space on the streets for bikes and scooters would improve their safety, right? And, you know, it's just funny to see this focus on proving these things from micromobility when, you know, cars, you know, are so clearly worse.
I think it's also notable to see the difference in reception that dock-based bike share got versus what micromobility has gotten to date, right? Like every city in the world wanted a dock-based bike share once Philippe opened in 2008. And I think there have been a lot of missteps by the industry that it hasn't really owned up to. I think a lot of cities do see these benefits and do see that the playing field is not particularly level right now, but the behavior and the track record of a lot of companies to date hasn't been one that has established a relationship of trust and a relationship where these cities really see the companies with aligned goals. I think the companies see themselves with aligned goals, but a lot of the ways that they behave do not come across that way to city officials. And it would do well for the companies to really get aligned on the types of like the values that they hold. I think obviously from being the sustainability person formerly at Bird, I think the life cycle assessment is a really important thing. I think there should be some basic criteria that companies all hold themselves to and that there are accountability. And then maybe that could earn the right and earn the respect and the trust of city governments to kind of relax some of these admittedly crazy RFP requirements.
Excellent. Anybody else? Awesome. Hey, well, thank you so much, Chris. Lovely to see you again.
See ya.
Cheers. All right. Next up, we have Steve Kendall. And Steve, I'd love if you're able to also just intro yourself as well. I don't understand what GB is.
Right. Oh. So Great Britain. That's an interesting camera view. Never mind. We'll move swiftly on, and we'll edit that out in the recording. So good evening, everybody from the UK or Great Britain, if you prefer, whichever is your geographical preference. I'm a little outsider here in many respects. I'm called an edge case, I think. Whilst I've got a license for everything with wheels and some for tracks, and I ride things that don't need a license, insurance, or training indeed, I'd still class myself as an outsider in the micromobility space, so treat me gently. I'm here from the Driving Vehicle Standards Agency, and we've got road safety and environmental protection at the heart of it. So the piece I was trying to get to for the panel really was this, this dichotomy between these types of vehicles in a road environment are perhaps classed as vulnerable, and then we need to think about how we protect that and what sort of policies we put around that. Yet if we move them into the pedestrianised space, then we end up with at the other end of the scale where the pedestrians are vulnerable, those that are infirm perhaps, or poor eyesight, or deaf, or other challenges, which means they're not on mobility to start with. So I'm just wondering what the team here, all this experience, all this knowledge, all this power, would think about doing in terms of a policy so that we can have safe integration.
Anybody want to take that? Melinda, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, yeah, or Michelle for that matter.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the specific question? I was reading some of the chat here on the side.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
no problem. It's the dichotomy around road safety or safety in general between these vehicles in a road safety environment versus these vehicles in some other environment, particularly the pedestrian environment, and how we put an effective policy together for these types of machines, given the two very different spaces that they could quite conceivably be operating in.
Yeah. I think the sort of consensus, so when the electric vehicles came on the scene, there was a lot of concern from traditional cyclists about whether or not these things belonged in the same lanes. And I think the consensus that has come today is that it's mostly about the speed and the weight of the vehicle. And if we give like speeds and like weights of things moving around our streets their own designated space, then that's really the best way to achieve safety overall for most streets. Now, Europe, of course, has had a lot of amazing success with doing shared streets where you don't actually need that breakdown between the different modes, but all speeds are kept, to 20 miles per hour or lower. And so that makes that actually feasibly safe.
I agree. And we're also starting to see some technology solutions where the vehicle can be slowed to 5 miles an hour if somebody takes a scooter onto the sidewalk. So there's definitely some technology that can assist, again, not without cost to the industry to do that. But, generally what we've seen in the US cities is to prohibit riding on the sidewalk to avoid, that clash with pedestrians. But, despite all the talk about it, I don't think there's actually been that much of a safety hazard to pedestrians in terms of, you know, collisions or damage or things actually happening, although it does prompt people to complain when they have a scooter whizzing by them on the sidewalk and it feels uncomfortable. And so I think the industry is trying to take steps to address that and to be, you know, to be cognizant of the issues that pedestrians have on sidewalks.
Yeah.
Space is an interesting one, because I think certainly here in the UK and even in Europe, we don't have the luxury of so much space. And so is the panel suggesting that its speed differential is one of the key factors here? If it's in a pedestrian space, we need to, whether it be in the pedestrian space or vehicular space, we need to constrain that speed differential.
Yep, I think that's right. And then just lowering speeds overall in cities, right? If everyone and everything is traveling slowly, then it works, for the maneuvering works.
Yeah.
I think, if I may jump in as well, Steve, not that I'm really a panelist, but I'd love to say something, which is that one of the things that we oftentimes talk about on our Micromobility podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is just that, you know, in some ways these are new vehicles, and they're like it's almost like the car when it first came into the city. You know, we didn't have a lot of the right stuff. We didn't have parking. We didn't have lanes. We didn't have, you know, there was no traffic infrastructure. All of that stuff came about because of the new technology of the car. And in some ways, we're trying to regulate them using the same things, but in some ways, it's about street space reallocation. And that is a really hard, knotty, you know, we have to take away car parking because you need to reallocate that space to dedicated lanes for these new kinds of vehicles. And we just think that there'll be a huge growth in that space, generally speaking, and that the most obvious thing is the thing that's hard to look at, and the one that people oftentimes don't really want to go and fight for car parking and things like that. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Oliver. And the only thing I'll add, so, you know, coming to StatTech, one thing I've appreciated is being able to, you know, merge policy planning and implementation. So I think, you know, even before you start to implement these regulations, you know, again, with data, you can get anonymous cell phone data, and I emphasize the word anonymous, but to understand what user behaviors are and, you know, where people are using different modes, and maybe one corridor, because we are starting to do a lot more work within corridors, might have less car traffic. So that might be the corridor to focus in on, to maybe even just get rid of cars or on the weekends and start to influence that change in behavior and expectations with regard to use of the infrastructure. And that can be a way to, you know, if you do the planning and understand, you know, how people are using your streets, then that can help you hopefully facilitate the deployment of some of these other solutions as well.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I guess to Oliver's point, and then I'll get out of the way, Oliver, honest. You know, we've got very different streets. Some of them are wide, almost American style. I've been fortunate enough to ride in California when they used to let us travel in novel and contentious ways. So I've had to go on plenty of stuff out there. But again, you've got the space in the sidewalks and in the streets. In very much 200 or 300-year-old cities, we don't have that capability of cobbled streets, uneven pavements, all those other kind of challenges. So we've got a real range of cities here, and so there's lots of challenge. You know, if we look at Milton Keynes, where they're doing a lot of novel and contentious mobility work, they have similar grid-based structures and wide open pavements, for example, which is just an easier challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining. It's great to have you here. And yeah, please just stay in the chat and love to hear more about it in the future. All right, excellent. Next up, if we could have, I'll just bring in Colin, who is policy with Lyft. I think
Hello.
should be able to just, there we go.
Yeah.
Excellent. And sorry, just 1 second, Steve, if I could just have you turn off your video. Or like, I think it just says turn off the video, and then we'll get you out of here. Thanks. Go for it, Colin.
Thanks, Oliver. Hello, everyone. Great to see you all. You know, really interesting conversation, and I kind of just wanted to talk about the evolution, I think, that we've seen in permits since they first came out, and I think it's really worth understanding that the first permit came out really to sharply limit the growth of micromobility, because it was in a phase where it was regulated, it was happening in ways that cities want. I think those were changes that needed to come, and were welcome and have afforded the sector a lot of progress. But now that the sector has evolved, these launches are happening in an orderly fashion. I think the companies and operators have done a lot of work to address public concerns about safety and sustainability and the impact on streets. That as those companies have evolved and as these approaches have evolved, so do the permits also need to evolve, so that we can get to a place where the biggest problems have been addressed and we can focus on the sector and micromobility succeeding. So that doesn't mean saying companies can do whatever they want, but it means giving them a little bit wider berth to grow and making sure that that it continues to be in a socially and environmentally sustainable manner. And one really small component of that I brought up is just insurance minimums. It's a really wonky subtopic, but I think illustrates this point. When micromobility first came out, cities required ultra high insurance minimums because they didn't know what the damage was going to be. They didn't know what the insurance risk was. But those minimums, often 2 to 3 times more insurance is required for a 30-pound scooter that can go 15 miles an hour than a rental car that anybody can go 100 miles per hour, weighs 5,000 pounds. Now that we have 2 or 3 years of data, we know what those claims are. I think like that's a perfect example of we could update that now and we could make that smaller than for sure what a car would have. And that's also another component of when you have an exorbitant requirement for micromobility that cars don't have, that does hold the sector back. That does make it more costly to bring the service to more people. And so all of that if we're not evolving the permits, it's going to be hard for the sector to have the investment to evolve as well.
Colin, are there cities that you think are taking a better approach to kind of rethinking permit processes? I mean, I kind of feel like, we just saw this like 170-page, tender in Los Angeles, which made me feel like it wasn't really going. And are there some cities that you think have taken a better approach or kind of a next generation approach that we should be looking at?
I would say that the approach that in general is always the most helpful is when operators are part of the discussion. And so not to point fingers, there are cities out there where they'll release a massive permit redo, and the first time operators see it or hear about it or have a chance to give feedback is when it's also coming to the public and maybe right about to pass council. And that's a really difficult time then, where sometimes these permits have issues that make operating almost impossible, or certainly impossible in terms of economics. And there's oftentimes really easy fixes where we can get to the same goal the city wants, be it related to safety or sustainability, but in a different way that will also make micromobility more likely to succeed. And those are the types of things we're always looking for. Those types of, hey, let's talk this out. Let's find a way to meet your goals and ours. But you can really only do that with discussion and through feedback. So the cities that are engaging in that, we really appreciate.
And so sort of a less prescriptive approach and more like, here's what we're trying to accomplish, rather than dictating up front the way to get there, because there might be other solutions that, some companies have come up with that the city's just not aware of.
Yeah. And we think the city goals are always reasonable. It's like, hey, we need to make sure we have safe streets. We need to make sure that this isn't going to create undue environmental impacts, or it's going to be equitable. And those are always really valid goals. I think we can just always find the best way to get there if, we have not just the companies, but also civil society. So we have advocates, we have the businesses, and we have the city planners all in the same conversation.
You mentioned that the world has kind of changed since we first started having these permit programs, and in part the venture capital funding has changed, and people are trying to get to profitability, and there's just a lot more focus on unit economics and less of the blitz scaling necessarily that we saw early on. I feel like a lot of the permit programs still are coming at the problem, assuming, as Melinda said, that the companies are bad actors or that they're, going to do things that are overly aggressive. But I feel the companies have completely changed, in their approach. And I'm just wondering if there's like an overreaction on that, in particular with respect to the number of scooters. So when you look at what cities are doing, do you think that they could dramatically increase the caps or make them more dynamic in order to really allow scooters to become a more reliable option for folks?
Yeah, great question. There's certainly been many examples of cities where they have a cap that really holds down the micromobility vehicle fleet in the city. And that's been an issue. There are other cities where, it's not necessarily a cap that's holding it down. It might be just the permit regulations as they are, that it's too costly to have a higher fleet, because of the permit, because maybe the fees or some of the service level rules. I do think that the city should be looking at some more dynamic means of regulation, and just also I think it's worth a conversation and some shared goal setting. So instead of a really prescriptive approach, it's how could we serve the whole city? What would you need in place to get to this goal, to this city or public goal? But certainly some of the dynamic ways of getting there are really good ones, and they can align the public goal of making sure that people have an option, but there's not too many on the street, with the private goal of right sizing the fleet to demand.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining. It's great to have you here.
Colin.
Thanks, all.
Excellent. All right. Next up we have a question that's coming in from Andrew Fleury. I think that's received a number of +1s in the comments. So Andrew, go wild.
I can't believe it. I'm on TV. This is great. Andrew from Luna. We're working on camera technology for pavement riding, things like that. And what we're seeing from the data we're getting back is I guess I naively assumed pavement riding was, from punk teenagers and stuff like that. But what we're seeing really most of the time is people go up on the sidewalk or the pavement or the footpath or whatever you call it from where you're from, because they're fearing for their life. So you can clearly see, and stuff that we captured, there's a truck coming the other way, they go up on the pavement. And then by basically having all these cameras out there, what we're seeing now is these are the hot spots, right? So this is clearly where we need to do something, because everybody goes on the pavement at this point. And it's to sort of say, okay, how does this mature to the point of, we have the concept of pop-up bike lanes and things like that. How does a policy get in place that we can now prioritize these, weak points within the city? What would that look like?
I mean, I think it's an excellent point. It's so consistent, right? We've seen this from the very early days of the shared micromobility industry, or even just as a cyclist, right? You don't want to ride on the sidewalk. It's not more pleasant to ride on the sidewalk. It's just less scary often to ride on the sidewalk. And so it is a very clear indication, if you see people on sidewalks with these vehicles, that is a place that needs dedicated, connected, and protected bike lanes. The core issue, unfortunately, tech will do something here and can do something to nudge people to do the right thing, but infrastructure is crucial. And I think, to my opening comments, it is just another argument that micromobility companies need to get more involved in the politics behind these things. It is really hard and it's really sticky, but that's where these decisions are made. I don't know, I imagine that many people who work at micromobility companies probably haven't even been to a community board meeting, which in New York is, if you ever suggest taking away a single parking space, you better watch your back after the meeting. It's a very intense and contentious discussion. And so, long-term goal would be finding a way to remove these policies from these, everything has to be litigated, every single teeny, half block of a bike lane has to go up for public approval. I don't think that that's the way to get this stuff done, right? We need large scale stuff. It is safety infrastructure. So the long-term goal should be to find a way to remove these infrastructure discussions from these like very local level opportunities for them to get smashed down. But in the meantime, I think there just needs to be more participation and more of these companies taking their really excellent data and turning it into good policy, stances and sharing that information with local policymakers and really supporting local advocacy organizations like in New York City, Transportation Alternatives is doing amazing work to advance this stuff.
I agree with all that. And, would love to see Luna take your data and say, hey, in this set of 3 blocks, everybody's, swerving onto the sidewalk because it's so dangerous, and just start, shaming cities into, identifying, where it is that the further infrastructure is needed. And I think, as a number of folks have said in the chat, we as an industry in micromobility need to start leveraging the power of our riders and the people who really want to use these devices to say, we have to show up and start making a difference in the local politics in order to make this happen. And when you write about how bike lanes need to be built, protected infrastructure, all this, the urbanists kind of throw up their hand. We've been to get things built for 20 years. This is like, you guys are just discovering this now, but it's impossible. We've been trying to do it forever. And I think the answer to that from micromobility has to be, we will show up and we will make a difference now because we are more riders and more users and a broader swath of the population who wants to use these things. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to show up and to really make a difference. But having your data, Andrew, having things be called out as to specific places where infrastructure can work.
Fantastic. Cool. Excellent. All right, hey folks. Well, look, we're right on. We're just about to end, and I wanted to give an opportunity for each of the panelists just to sort of sum up, and if there's anything that they'd like to do in terms of like connecting in or being able to continue on this discussion. So maybe if we could just have each of you do a sort of 10-20 seconds about how people can get in touch with you and be able to progress that conversation. Maybe we'll do the same order but reversed. So we'll go Greg, Melinda, Andrew.
Sure. Thanks, Oliver. So thanks everybody for listening to us. Thanks for a really insightful conversation. The comment, maybe to sum things up, I think it is all about infrastructure. And just to make the point, there is a lot of downtown urbanization, revitalization going on, and to really merge development, land use with incentivizing some of these solutions and creating infrastructure to make them safe. There's a key opportunity. So, it's not always all on the city. There are ways to incentivize the change with developers as well. They have an incentive to not want to build tremendous amounts of parking either. So just some food for thought there. For further conversations on LinkedIn, Twitter @SmarterTranspo, and at Stantec, greg.rodriguez@stantec.com. So please drop me a note. My colleague, Dan Hem, has been hitting the chat box pretty hard too. So we love to geek out about this stuff. So look forward to continuing the conversation. And I have a podcast called the Mobility Podcast. That's a little fun side hustle. So always welcome chatting there too. Thanks again.
Thanks, Greg. Cheers.
Yeah, I guess one last thing that didn't come up here that I do think, there's obviously the political willingness part that is a huge part of the infrastructure conversation needs to happen. But another thing that's maybe even easier that these companies can get involved in is really celebrating when public officials, like the ones that you're occasionally battling with, do something really excellent. Like I'm seeing in the chat box, New York City finally is repurposing some car lanes for bike lanes across the major bridges, and that's amazing. And if every single company that is trying to get into New York City right now in the permit, did some celebration, like called out some names, like made people feel good and built more momentum and support around this, like that's another excellent way to get involved. Very excited to talk about this stuff anytime. Reach me at melinda@electricavenue.city.
Great. I'm going to take I love the bike infrastructure conversation. I love nothing more than bike lanes. Montreal's pretty good at it. But I will pivot also to say, don't forget digital infrastructure, just to, plug my own topic for a while. And it can be vitally important in the long run too. And if that's interesting, I would say I recommend learning more about what Heidi mentioned in the work they're doing at Mobility Data. But if you want to talk to me about it, Andrew at Transit App. It's so rare to get an Andrew at email that I have to plug that one. And obviously Twitter is always a good place. I'm at Andrew Salzberg. So it's great to be here.
Thanks everyone for chiming in today. I'm at Michelle Kairouz on Twitter and Medium. My Substack is Smarter Cars. It's a Smarter Cars podcast. We cover all forms of transportation there as well. And I'm also on Clubhouse. If we're doing these Clubhouse chat things, ping me. I also have some invites if some people want to get into Clubhouse. But it was great talking with you all, and feel free to reach out to me. Would love to have further conversations.
Marvelous. This was a fantastic discussion. I'm so stoked with how this went. So